Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South, by Karen L. Cox, narrated by Pam Ward. Prologue. Like most late summer evenings in Natchez, it was hot and steamy that Thursday when 68-year-old Jane Sergeant Merrill settled in her home, Glen Burnie, to wait for her cousin, Duncan Minor, to arrive. Known by locals as Miss Jennie, she had become increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving her estate except to run errands in town. One of the few guests she welcomed was Duncan, also 68, who would saddle his horse every night at his nearby estate, Oakland, and ride the short distance to see Jennie, returning home just before dawn broke. Their ritual was decades old, but on that night in August 1932 it would come to an abrupt end. On his ride to Glen Burnie, two local black citizens, Willie Boyd and M.C. Hatcher, waved Minor down. Boyd reported that while he was on his way to church, he heard what sounded like gunshots and screaming coming from Glen Burnie. Alarmed, Duncan urged his horse to gallop the rest of the way, arriving at a house cloaked in darkness. He called out for Jennie, but no one replied. He fumbled for a lantern, only for the light to reveal that her home had been ransacked. Furniture lay askew. There was evidence of a struggle, and the walls were smeared with blood. But there was no sign of his cousin. One of her hired hands rushed to a nearby store to phone the sheriff of Adams County, and in a matter of hours Duncan's worst fears were confirmed. Jennie had been murdered. Within days, the crime would make headlines nationwide. Natchez had once been a fine jewel in the crown of the region's cotton kingdom, and the writers covering the story of Jennie Merrill's murder couldn't help but remark on her connection to the town's planter aristocracy. They wrote about her life of privilege as a belle of the Old South, but also about her retreat into seclusion in recent years. Poignant as the story of a murdered scion of the Southern aristocracy may have been, however, the media's focus quickly shifted to her eccentric neighbors, Richard, Dick, Dana, and Octavia Dockery, who were arrested for her murder. They, too, were descendants of Southern elites, but lived in squalor at Glenwood, a two-story Greek Revival mansion that was falling down around them. The press called it Goat Castle, a reference to its once grand status as a Southern mansion, as well as to the four-legged residents who shared the home with the odd pair. Years later, the crime became known as the Goat Castle murder, with Merrill's death an afterthought. The press's obsession with the Southern Gothic spectacle of Glenwood and its residents, and of the Southern aristocracy in decline, meant ignoring another side of the story. The only person to stand trial for Jennie Merrill's murder was an African-American domestic named Emily Burns. She was no guiltier of the crime than Dana or Dockery, but in the Jim Crow South, the arrest and conviction of a Negro was expected. Like so many other Southern blacks who were caught in an unjust legal system, Emily Burns was virtually erased from community memory, becoming a footnote in a saga that had gripped the nation. The murder of Jennie Merrill and the vivid spectacle of Goat Castle captured America's attention throughout the fall of 1932. It made such an impression that newspapers and popular magazines made reference to it for several years after. And yet, the actual facts of the case have long given way to vague community memories, speculation about who killed Jennie Merrill, and even ghostly legend. In the Natchez City Cemetery, however, headstones serve as reminders of what was very real. Jane Sergeant Merrill is buried in the Merrill family plot. The long granite ledger marking her grave is etched with a large Celtic cross, her name, and the day of her death, August 4th, 1932. Less than 100 yards away, Dick Dana, born Richard Henry Clay Dana, is buried in the small gated plot of his family. A modest marker bears only his name and birth and death dates. Less than 10 yards from his final resting place is a simple headstone that marks the grave of Octavia Dockery, who lived with Dick Dana and served as his guardian. A local group of citizens placed it there in the months following her death. Mistress of Goat Castle is carved below her name. It was a title she both reviled and revelled in. The grave of Emily Burns, tried and convicted as an accessory to first-degree murder in Merrill's death, will not be found there. She is buried in an unmarked grave in Skinner's Cemetery on a shady hillside off of Liberty Road, where the members of her church, Antioch Baptist, are laid to rest. And while stories about the Goat Castle murder have circulated for decades in Natchez, memories of Emily Burns are practically non-existent. Sentenced to spend the rest of her life at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in late November 1932, she was swiftly forgotten, as were the facts that led to her conviction. The course of this case may seem perfectly ordinary. In the Jim Crow South, justice for the murder of a white woman often meant the conviction of a black person. In Mississippi, blacks convicted of petty crimes could end up at Parchman, the state penitentiary. There they labored in the cotton fields like their slave ancestors had before them, working under the supervision of a gun-toting white man on horseback. While a murder conviction often meant death by execution, Emily Burns instead received a life sentence because the jury could not agree on her punishment. And yet, almost 8 years to the day when she arrived at the prison, Governor Paul B. Johnson suspended her sentence. She quietly returned to Natchez, where she lived until her death in September 1969. So why did the national media pick up this story and follow it daily until the trial ended? Why did newspapers and magazines continue to publish articles about the crime for decades? Why was the case a cause célèbre? Part of the answer lay in the popularity of true crime stories in the 1930s. During the Depression, true crime sold newspapers and magazines and served as a cheap form of entertainment for Americans during desperate economic times. Such stories frequently involved the demise of prominent individuals and were fixated on the salacious details of family dysfunction. The murder of Jennie Merrill in Natchez, Mississippi, had all of this, and then some. Generally, such stories were only of local interest, but Jennie Merrill's murder made national news. One New York Times headline about the case hints at why it attracted such attention. Neighbor pair held in Natchez murder. R.H. Dana and his housekeeper charged with slaying Miss Merrill over goats. 3 members of aristocratic families, all 60 or more, lived lives as recluses. Murder, aristocracy, recluses, and goats. These were subjects more likely to be found in a Southern Gothic novel, and, in fact, journalists immediately drew parallels to the fiction of Edgar Allan Poe, and later William Faulkner's novels about the social decay of old Southern families. But this was no fictional tale. The eccentric personalities and the economic and even mental decline among these descendants of once respected families was all true, and it drew reporters and voyeuristic tourists alike to Natchez that fall and for years to come. The basic facts of the crime are straightforward. Near dusk on the evening of August 4th, 1932, someone shot and killed Jennie Merrill, by all accounts a very petite woman, during an attempted robbery in her home, Glen Burnie. The perpetrators then carried her body about 100 yards from the house, where they dumped it in a thicket. Merrill's neighbors, Dick Dana, 61, and Octavia Dockery, 67, were among the first to be taken in for questioning, and, within a few days, charged with murder. Their constant feuding with Merrill made them likely suspects. Yet despite the fact that their fingerprints were retrieved from inside of Merrill's home, a judge released them on their own recognizance to return to Glenwood after a 10-day stint in the Adams County Jail. Meanwhile, 2 African Americans were targeted as murder suspects. One was 57-year-old Lawrence Williams, an Adams County native who had migrated to Chicago years before. He had come to Natchez in July in hopes of finding work, which was difficult to come by during the Depression, especially for a black man. While there, he met Emily Burns, a widowed 37-year-old domestic who, along with her mother, took in boarders to supplement her income. Williams, known in Chicago as George Pearls, appears to have struck up a romance with Burns, and after knowing her for less than a week, he moved to the home she shared with her mother on St. Catherine Street. Within hours of Jennie Merrill's murder, he vacated town so swiftly that he left behind his trunk of personal belongings. While making his way home to Chicago, a police deputy in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, stopped Williams for reasons unrelated to the crime in Natchez. The deputy shot and killed him, he said, for resisting arrest and allegedly refusing to answer questions. The gun found among Williams's possessions, it turned out, used bullets that were subsequently matched with the type recovered from the crime scene in Natchez. A few days later, the Adams County sheriff, tipped off by a local who had met Williams, recovered Williams's trunk and arrested Emily Burns and her mother, Nellie Black. Burns later gave a coerced confession after a week of intense questioning. Several weeks later, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, a jury of 12 white men from Adams County convicted George Pearls, alias Lawrence Williams, posthumously, after which Emily Burns stood trial as his accomplice. Her conviction was swift. At most, she was at the scene of the crime, but she did not kill Jennie Merrill. These were the facts. Yet almost from the outset, journalists were obsessed with Dick, Dana, and Octavia Dockery and their home, Glenwood. The dilapidated mansion had been Dana's childhood home and was his inheritance. For years he had boarded in different homes throughout Natchez, but around 1916, Dick and Octavia moved into Glenwood, where they lived out the rest of their lives. Technically, because of his inability to pay property taxes, Dick Dana no longer owned the property, but neither of them had any place else to go. And so he and Octavia lived there for more than 3 decades without ever paying taxes or rent, while repeated attempts to evict them failed. The two were, for all intents and purposes, squatters among the ruins of what had once been a respectable abode. The contrasts between what had been and what was now was not lost on reporters. While the first headlines focused on Jennie Merrill's death, "Rich Woman Recluse Slain in Mississippi," and "Elderly Recluse Slain in South," they soon gave way to "Weird Mississippi Murder Traced to Row Over Goats," and "Southern Goat Castle Scene of a Tragedy," and others like it. A jailhouse photo of Dick and Octavia accompanied the articles. Stern and unsmiling, she looked like a weathered farm wife. She wore a straw hat, and a smock covered her morning dress. Dick's hair looked unkempt. He had not shaved for several days, and he wore filthy coveralls. He sat to her left with his hands in his lap, and had a wild-eyed expression that suggested he might be mentally off-kilter, which, indeed, he was. His interviews with the press could be rambling and nonsensical. Octavia seemed to enjoy the attention, and actually welcomed interviews with reporters as a ploy to shape a narrative of her life as a one-time Southern belle who had fallen on hard times. And then there were the goats. They not only roamed the grounds of Glenwood, but also feasted on the wallpaper and books inside its walls. The home had long ago descended into shocking condition. It was ankle-deep in filth and overrun with animals: ducks, geese, chickens, cats, dogs, and especially goats. By the time of the murder, Glenwood had literally become Goat Castle. Indeed, the goats lived better than the humans with whom they shared the house. In the days following their arrest, photographs and descriptions of the home's condition also circulated, along with references to Dana as a wild man and Dockery as the goat woman. This intrigued the public and sold newspapers, which is why, generations later, locals still refer to it as the Goat Castle murder. In many ways, the lives of Jennie Merrill, Duncan Minor, Lawrence Williams / George Pearls, and Emily Burns, all central figures in this crime, have been overshadowed. America's fascination with stories about the Old South helped drive the reports coming out of Natchez, especially because of Merrill's connection to great planter wealth. Goat Castle aside, The town was home to numerous antebellum mansions, the kind that Hollywood tried to recreate in movies of the era, so many of which were set in the pre-Civil War South. They were also homes that attracted visitors, even before there was a definable tourism industry for the South's plantation heritage. Since the dawn of automobile tourism, and particularly after Henry Ford began producing the affordable Model T, tourists from the Northeast and Midwest traveled to Natchez to see its architectural treasures. They trespassed on the grounds of the grand estates, just to catch a glimpse of the magnificent homes with stately names like Melrose, Dunleith, and Stanton Hall. During the spring of 1932, only a few months before the Merrill murder, several of the homes were opened to the public for the very first time in their history. Many of the direct descendants of the families who built the houses still lived in them, and some greeted their guests dressed in their ancestors' clothing. Their efforts proved wildly successful, and magazine writers lauded pilgrimage festivities as an authentic representation of life in the antebellum South. Throughout the 1930s, popular magazines, as well as national and regional newspapers, encouraged their readers to travel to Natchez. The Garden Club promoted the opportunity to experience what life was like before the Civil War, made possible not only by the homeowners, but also by local blacks in the role of house slaves and carriage drivers. Jennie Merrill's murder and the notoriety of Goat Castle, however, stood in stark contrast to the pilgrimage motto, "Come to Natchez, where the Old South still lives." It was no small feat to reach Natchez in the early 1930s. There were no airports, and what counted as a highway was not much more than a dirt road. For travelers from a western state like Texas, the Mississippi River presented an additional challenge once they arrived in the town of Vidalia, Louisiana, directly across the river from Natchez. Ferries provided the only way across until a bridge was built in 1940. And yet, during the depths of the Great Depression, thousands of American tourists sought out Natchez. They boarded ferries and crossed the Mississippi River, drove their cars over treacherous terrain, and traveled by trains from the Northeast and the Midwest to venture to this remote location to experience what impressed them as a living, breathing, and genuine example of the Old South. Why Americans ventured to Natchez has a lot to do with its history, a history that made the town a temptress of sorts. As journalist David Cohn wrote in an issue of the Atlantic Monthly in 1940, Natchez was a lady. She was the oldest settlement on the lower half of the Mississippi River, and earned her name from her original inhabitants, the Natchez Indians. Her suitors included the French, who established Fort Rosalie in 1716, the English. Following the 7 Years' War with England, the fort was ceded to the British in 1763. The Spanish, from 1779 to 1798, during which time Natchez began to take shape as a city, laid out in the common grid pattern under territorial governor Manuel Galloso de Lemos. And finally the Americans in 1798, when Lady Natchez came under the control of the U.S. government. The town has had its fair share of famous visitors throughout its history, even before the Civil War. When it was the capital of the Mississippi Territory, former Vice President Aaron Burr was the first arrested near Natchez for conspiring to create a separate nation, though he was released and later acquitted on charges of treason. 2 decades later, the American naturalist John James Audubon spent a few months there painting birds. He also enrolled his sons at nearby Jefferson Academy, a military school for young boys. P.T. Barnum brought the Swedish singing sensation Jenny Lind to Natchez in 1851, where she performed to a sellout crowd, as she had done in cities across the United States. Northerners from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Maine, Connecticut, Maryland, and Massachusetts came too. Between the 1830s and the 1850s, they purchased large tracts of land in Louisiana and Mississippi, staking their claim to the profits of the region's cotton boom. While stately homes were built for families of wealth in Natchez proper, the life of a country gentleman was to be found in the gently rolling hills on the outskirts of town, There, planters created large estates, which, in addition to very grand homes, included outbuildings and slave quarters. Melrose typified this model. Melrose was built for the McMurrin family during the 1840s. The home sat back from the main road, and in the 19th century travelers made the long approach to Melrose in a horse-drawn carriage. Bouncing along the dirt path, guests of Melrose passed through a romantic landscape. At the entryway was an ornamental pond, and later a bog surrounded by cypress trees dressed in Spanish moss, after which visitors drove through a canopy of tall trees. As the home came into view, it seemed to grow larger in size. House slaves greeted guests and took their trunks and luggage, leading them into the house through the imposing portico. The McMurrins filled their home with all that fine taste and a full purse could afford. Silk draperies, painted canvas floor coverings, and ornate Rococo-style furniture. A hand-carved mahogany punkah, operated by slaves, shooed flies away from the food served on the long dining-room table, as well as provided dinner guests with a gentle breeze. Service itself had been modernized relative to the antebellum era through a system of bells linked between the main house and the brick dependencies where house slaves were quartered. Such estates often were filled with the best porcelain and silver money could buy, and objets d'art from Europe. In fact, traveling through Europe was seen as a rite of passage for the sons of the planter elite before they assumed their role in the family business. Frederick Quitman, for example, took a 6-month tour of Europe that included the British Isles, Switzerland, Venice, and Milan, following his graduation from Princeton in 1853. Only then did he return to manage his father's sugar plantation. Not everyone lived as well as the planters, however, and Natchez was not always ladylike. Down below the bluffs, the area known as Natchez under the Hill had a different historical reputation altogether. It was one of the most notorious river landings on the Mississippi River, peopled with gamblers, thieves, swindlers, and prostitutes. Boatmen who traveled up and down the river loading cotton and unloading slaves frequented its saloons, and knife fights were a regular feature on the levee below Natchez proper. Still, it was the wealth and the mansions above the bluffs that defined Natchez. The town was an important link in the global market for cotton, much of which was shipped directly to New York and Liverpool, England. The booming British textile industry created the demand for the cotton coming from the lower Mississippi Valley. A labor-intensive crop, cotton required substantial numbers of slaves, and as demand for it increased, America's domestic slave trade rapidly expanded too. Between 750,000 and 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated to the Deep South, roughly 2/3 of whom were sold through the mechanisms of the slave trade. For most, their first stop was the port of New Orleans. By 1850, it was the 3rd largest city in the country and the epicenter of America's domestic slave trade. Most of them were purchased by slave traders in the upper South states of Maryland and Virginia, where tobacco farming had depleted the soil and was being replaced by other, less labor-intensive crops. As a result, slave trading became a business of supply and demand. Planters in the upper South had the supply, and the demand for slaves resided in the Deep South. Between October and January, New Orleans annually received ships filled with slaves from Maryland and Virginia. Once they arrived in the Crescent City, they were thrown into one of the high-walled pens or holding areas in the city's slave market. To entice potential buyers, slave traders dressed men in suits, while female slaves wore gingham dresses. They were among the thousands of men, women, and children sold on a daily basis, whose final destinations were the plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi. Many were taken and sold in slave markets upriver, including Natchez, the 2nd largest slave market in the Deep South, outside of New Orleans. The town was integral to this slave network. It had active slave markets as early as 1801, but its most famous, and the largest, was the slave market known as the Forks of the Road, where Washington Road and Liberty Road intersected. The Forks, established after an 1830 ordinance was passed to keep traders out of the city limits, served as the basis of operations for numerous slave traders, including the firm of Franklin and Armfield. Isaac Franklin of Tennessee purchased property at the Forks for the express purpose of slave sales, while his nephew John Armfield operated the firm's slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia. Together they became two of the most active slave traders in the United States, buying slaves for low prices in Virginia, and then selling them for considerable profit in Natchez. Like other slave traders at the Forks, they built rudimentary pens to hold the human chattel they brought to the area from other slave markets. Rectangular in shape and built from wood, they offered nothing in the way of human comforts because they were considered temporary shelter. Joseph Ingraham, in his book The Southwest by a Yankee, published in 1835, described the shelter for slaves as old unoccupied buildings, and often tents or booths, pitched upon the common. He also detailed the march of slaves from the river landing below the Natchez bluffs. Passing through the city in procession, sometimes dressed in a new uniform purchased for them in New Orleans, but often in the brown rags in which they left Virginia, preceded by a large wagon carrying the surplus baggages, they are marched beyond the city limits to the forks of the road. Since Congress abolished the African slave trade in 1808, Natchez planters relied on the domestic slave trade to meet their needs. In addition to the slaves shipped to New Orleans from Baltimore, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia, and eventually brought upriver to Natchez, slave traders marched thousands more overland. These coffles of slaves, large groups bound together by chains, were force-marched from Virginia to Tennessee. Then, just outside of Nashville, they traveled down the old Indian trading path known as the Natchez Trace. By the time they reached Natchez, a journey of several weeks, they had walked more than 1,000 miles. Once there, they were prepared for their sale to the owners of area estates, who held thousands of acres in Adams County and neighboring Jefferson County, and across the river in Concordia Parish, Louisiana. The slaves are made to shave and wash in greasy pot liquor to make them look sleek and nice, wrote William Anderson, who was sold in Natchez in the early 19th century. Their heads must be combed, their best clothes put on, and when called out to be examined, they must stay in a row, the women and men apart. Then they are picked out and taken to a room and examined. Men and women, husbands and wives, were often sold separately. Anderson also described children being torn from their mother's arms and sent away, never to be seen again. The weeping and crying he heard disturbed him, but the reaction of the slave owners was to quell the noise by beating the slaves with a lash. These scenes were repeated for decades, and took place within sight of Monmouth, Linden, and Devereux, the mansions owned by some of the wealthiest of the town's slave owners. When the Civil War erupted, the world that Natchez planters enjoyed came to a swift end. Union troops arrived there in August 1863, after having seized Vicksburg, another town that sat atop bluffs farther upriver from Natchez. Planters in Natchez had divided loyalties, both Union and Confederate, but regardless of their sympathies, the Yankees moved quickly to seize control of their estates. While officers fashioned headquarters inside the mansions, soldiers pitched tents on the grounds around them. Those who remained loyal to the Union, some of whom entertained Federal troops while they occupied Natchez, were the most fortunate. Down below the bluffs, the Federal Army established a slave contraband camp and, most alarming to Natchez residents, placed black soldiers on street patrol. The Union occupiers also placed black troops at the forks of the road slave market, where they were quickly joined by slaves who had abandoned local plantations. The very existence of black soldiers struck fear into the hearts of white Natchezians, but having them stationed at the forks sent the message that the days of chattel slavery were numbered. A New York Times correspondent traveling with the Army commented on what the locals likely took for granted, the city's riches. It contains more wealth in proportion to its inhabitants than perhaps any town in the whole country, either north or south. It is a common saying here that if a man is not worth $1 million, he is not considered well off, he wrote. The wealthiest planters and largest slaveholders were, according to the Times reporter.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?